So very quickly, we're going to be talking about the outcome document from phase 2019. I hope you all received it when I sent in the joining details. All our three guests have joined us now, Furaha, Sheila, and Aisha, and I will be introducing them in a few seconds. So what we hope to do is to have about 30 minutes conversation about the document itself. Note that the session is being recorded. Your microphones are on mute, apart from the speakers who will be unmuting while they are speaking, hopefully. Any questions or comments you have, please use the link. Link has been sent to you, but just in case. Twitter hashtag, if you are a Twitterer, Face 2020, if you would like to comment on what we're saying. Again, remember, tweeting about it and using the hashtag is not mandatory, but will be greatly appreciated. And the outcome document, since we're not printing it yet, we are welcome to any comments, suggestions you have on that. And just before we go to the speakers, a few fun facts about the Pan-African flag. So I've talked a lot about Pan-Africanism in yesterday's seminar, but I didn't mention anything about the Pan-African flag, which has three colors, red, green, and black. And you may notice that in my dress code, I am trying to stick to the Pan-African colors. So yesterday was red, today is green, maybe tomorrow will be black. So one interesting fun fact about the Pan-African flag is at the time of independence, which was around 1960, most of the African countries on the continent chose a flag that had at least one of the colors of the Pan-African flag. So most of the countries, I think about 52 countries in Africa, have in their flag one color of the Pan-African flag. There are at least 15 countries in the Pan-African world that incorporate all three colors. So red, green, and black are included in these countries' flags. So if you want to sort of think about that, reflect about that while we are having this discussion, please comment on the Slido which of these, if you can mention all 15, you will get a massive shout out. So all 15 countries, at least 15 countries that have the Pan-African flag. So again, our contact information, if you want to in any way sort of follow the work that we do, that's our Twitter, Instagram, our webpage, our Facebook, and our email. So you can contact us in those ways. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing. Ooh. And admit. Okay, so I think the next thing to do is to introduce. Yeah, I'm trying to find. Yeah, I think I did. I put you on spotlight, didn't I? Introduce our guest today. So since I put Sheila on spotlight anyway, start with Sheila. So Sheila is a graduate of the Law School, University of Bristol. She's currently rounding up her LPC LLM, and her pronouns are she and her. Furaha, Dr. Furaha Asani, is a writer, mental health advocate, and a precarious migrant. And let me see if I can find Aisha. So yeah, hi Aisha. I have made you a co-host now, which means you can mute and unmute your microphone. Let me spotlight you. Yeah. So Aisha Thomas is a teacher in Bristol City. She is, you should definitely see her TED Talk on representation. It's absolutely beautiful. I think it's included on our website. She has been advocating for representation in Bristol University, not Bristol University, Bristol City schools for quite a while now. She's someone you should definitely follow her work. Okay, so I'm just going to give, yeah, I need to figure out how to use this thing. Sort of a brief background on the outcome document, and I'm not going to speak, I'm trying to be very brief with this. So the outcome document, phase 2019 outcome document, is essentially sort of one of the major milestones or products that FACE has created. So FACE 2019, the conference, the theme of the conference was building the Pan-African inspired multiversity. And arising from a lot of what we discussed yesterday, the question of how exactly do you ensure that education, especially higher education, because that's where we are located, but how do we ensure that education generally centers the needs, the epistemological needs of African and African descended populations? So what we did was to have speakers. We had a conference and we put this question to, prior to the conference, we put this question to the speakers, and they came up with ideas about how, from their own, from their own experience, research and work, how this question can be answered. If you think about, the concept of building Pan-African inspired multiversity, apart from the epistemic question, so what exactly should this contain, there are also logistic questions. And we discussed this a little bit yesterday. How possible is it to actually have a Pan-African inspired sort of curriculum within a higher education sort of structure, which has already shunted those knowledges aside? So one question or one answer to how do you build Pan-African inspired multiversity would be, should we Pan-Africanize our current education institutions, or should we have something parallel? Or, so there are lots of logistic questions that we also try to answer. So I do encourage you, if you haven't read the outcome document, please do read it. And if you have comments, please let us know. So I'm going to be asking the speakers a few questions, a couple of questions about the document, and also, generally the concept of building Pan-African inspired multiversity. So the first question, which I will ask all three of you, is which of the outcome points, so we have an executive summary, which I would say is a good starting point, which do you think is the most important, especially in the context of where we are now? Which do you think is the most important to get on with now, and how? So I think I will start with Aisha. Which of the outcome document points do you think is most important, and why?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, brilliant. I think for me, it covers a lot of really, really crucial points, but I think in this time more than ever, it has to be the educational curricula, in particularly African history and achievement. I think the current education system as it stands, right from early years, right through to secondary and through to university level, very much has a condensed view of the commitment that the African diaspora and Pan-Africanism has made to the education system. And it has a very condensed and superficial view. And often what happens is the focus tends to be very much about slavery. It then tends to focus very much about a few people who have helped in terms of civil activism, and then very few comments around sporting commitments. What it then doesn't do is tell us about the wonderful continent that Africa is, the rich resource of the different communities, understanding the countries that exist, and ensuring that children understand that there is a value within African communities, their skin, their culture, their music, their food, and therefore that creates the disparity between communities. And what it continues to do within the education system is perpetuate the continual ideology that Black communities are unfortunately insubordinate or greater than, which is not good for our young people when they're trying to identify what it means in terms of understanding self, what it means in terms of understanding discrimination. Children in the future that have a good understanding and understand what each other contributes, we need to make sure that the curriculum definitely emphasizes that point and ensures that that information is shared and that those children are empowered with that knowledge and information. And only when that is done do I really feel we are going to be educating our young people to value each other.
Thank you. I think I'll hand over to Furaha now. Same question.
Thank you so much. So I just want to quickly point out that I have all the three colors, red, green, and black in my jacket. And I'm going to go with the point of African solidarities. So to cut a long story short, I really need to see the end of homophobia and transphobia within the Pan-African movement. I really would like a situation where every Black person, every African person, every African descended person knows that they are an equal heir within this family. And in order to do that, we need to end all forms of intrafamily bigotry. I'm also going to then quickly jump into the point of involving Africans within research. So those of us who have the privilege, now is the time to start pulling up our siblings. Now is the time to really ask ourselves the questions if we are the correct ones to be, using or always taking up space, especially on certain platforms. Now is the time to really advocate. If we want to improve humanity, if we want to just increase accessibility to education, then we really need to sometimes just shut up and sit down and allow our up and coming younger siblings, maybe even older siblings, aunties and uncles, who have never had the spotlight, who have never had the platform. We need to, kind of just give them the chance to speak. So I would say that those are my 2 points.
Sheila, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for both your contributions so far, Furaha and Aisha, and thank you so much, Dr. Adebisi, for having me on this panel. I want to reiterate what Furaha said about building solidarities across all justice groups and about Africans coming together and supporting every single Black person. I want to address it in the context of decolonizing education because I think it requires community accountability. It requires radical self and community care, and it requires the inclusion of all Afro-descended people in the construction of a multiversity. This moment in time is showing us that there is a possibility of a new and a better world. We can see it on the edge of the horizon, but it won't be a new world or a free world if all we achieve is power that is proximate to that of our oppressors. To paraphrase Paulo Freire, the oppressor is dehumanized when they believe that their humanity is contingent upon the dehumanization of another. And I think they're also dehumanized when they ignore the oppression of another, or they silence them when they try to speak out about their oppression. This is true of white supremacy, and we know this, but it's also true of a Black movement which excludes and doesn't explicitly fight for all Black people. I think about this in the context of misogynoir. I think about this in the context of ableism, homophobia, transphobia, all of the structures of oppression that we have internalized and we mete out across other members of our movement and other members of our societies. And I think we need to really introspect and consider how we can move forward together and how we can not only accept people, but listen to their concerns and action them.
Have you on Spotlight. So while I have you on Spotlight, can I just ask, so how do you think we should go about doing any of, do you have any suggestions for us?
Yes, well, I think FACE has a really wonderful opportunity. Well, it brings people together. It's intergenerational, it's multidisciplinary. And I think there's also an opportunity now to partner with organizations that are radical and that are pushing for radical inclusion of all Black voices. I think of the Free Black University, which has recently been started by Mel Zawusu, and which aims to help disseminate free, radical, anti-colonial education to all Black people. And it centers Black liberation, Black healing, climate justice. It doesn't hide away from the difficult conversations that we as a community need to have. I think also that supporting radical organizations such as this one is, it's urgent. You know, we are seeing conversations about police abolition. We are talking about transphobia within our movements. And these conversations have been had for many, many years beforehand, but they were deemed too radical. They were deemed issues that we want to keep on the fringe, but now we're actually having them at the center of our discussions. And I think it's really important that we uplift radical voices, because radical voices, a podcaster called Wesley Morris put it in a really interesting way when he said that, you know, the last 400 or 500 years have been absolute madness. And the only way that we can actually restore a level of, well, the only way that we can bring about freedom is by being really out there with our demands for change, being really out there and bold about what we can imagine the world to be. And I think that requires us to invest in radical thought. I think also that coronavirus has shown us that there are multiple ways of educating students. There are multiple ways of engaging students and assessing them and taking into account their accessibility needs. This has been a really traumatic time for Black students, quite honestly, Black people in general. And I mean, if we don't center self-care and community care, if we don't have a space for us to recover as well as to fight, we're not going to be able to go the distance. We're not going to be able to push forward. Dr. Nathaniel Coleman put it brilliantly when they said that our social movements, if they're to be decolonial, need to be the sorts of spaces that we don't have to take a break from. Because if they make us ill and indeed oppress us, then they won't be spaces in which we can dwell and grow. And I think if our space isn't focusing on community and self-care, on mutual aid, on ways for us to care about each other and for each other outside of capitalist frameworks, and if it is still oppressing members of the community, then it won't be a space productive to healing. It won't be a space that can produce a really motivated and cohesive group of people ready to fight for a new world.
Thank you, Sheila. You nearly made me cry there. Furaha, let me spotlight you. So you gave some suggestions about building African solidarities around, you know, research, and especially those of us in the diaspora, for example, using our privilege. Yeah. Do you have any practical suggestions about how we would go forward with this?
Yes. So I'm glad actually that Sheila has kind of covered how we can partner with organizations, because I want to focus on us as individuals. I think that it's often very easy for us to say, okay, well, I'm part of this organization, so that's it. I'm not going to do anything on the individual level, but we have to. Before I talk about what I'm planning to do, I just want to highlight, and because we've not attached any trigger warnings, I'm not going to go too into details, but those of us on Twitter know that over the past couple of days, a lot of Black women in different parts of the world have been coming forward with stories of how they've been harmed. And I think that part of the healing process is all of us, rather than scrolling past those stories, except obviously I know that, you know, it could be triggering for a lot of us, but those of us who have the strength to do so, not ignoring our siblings, please, and questioning how we can protect them, and doing the work of saying, of admitting how we failed them in the past. How can we protect our children? So this is part of it. This is a part of the accountability. So I just want to say that on the individual level, we all have that responsibility. Now, in terms of being an academic, I was invited because, you know, now everybody's feeling guilty and they're all suddenly coming to us for Black Lives Matter advice and assistance, and, you know, offering fees for consultation, which is always appreciated. Yes, pay us for our work. I've been invited into one of the top, I think 3 universities or whatever for some advisory board, blah, blah, blah. They've invited me into a meeting tomorrow. And my strategy when I go into that meeting is to ask them how many more Black people are they going to bring into this space, because I think it's too easy for them to use me as their light-skinned Black woman token, okay, to say, oh, we've done something for Black Lives Matter, but have you really? So again, on the individual level, those of us with privilege, when we enter these spaces, we need to start making room for our siblings. It is not, no, the time for tokenization, there was never a time, but that time is over. And I know that we don't have power in the sense of power of white supremacy. However, if we have a little bit of privilege, please stick your foot in that door and push that door open for your siblings to get in. So on an individual level, I cannot say, specifically what everyone can do, but it really, we need to reflect on how we can best use our privilege and our platform. So I hope that that gives, a little bit of an idea. Like I said, that is what I'm going to do tomorrow, and it doesn't end tomorrow. Wherever I find myself, I'm going to keep doing that. If you have the strength to do so, please consider mentoring up-and-coming Black, not just academics. Please consider looking, if you're a white person in this space, consider looking for opportunities for Black kids. Consider opening your purses. Somebody like Aisha Thomas, have you seen the work she's doing? Sorry, Aisha, I hope I've gotten your pronouns correctly. Have you seen the work Aisha is doing? Can you, look for opportunities for Aisha? Can you find people who can open their purses? So my point is, there are different ways. If you have no idea, but you have the funds, you have the access to funds, send them to the people who need those funds. Send them, use them to bless, people who are doing the work. So many things that we can do on an individual level. It's great that we're working with societies, but I really think that we shouldn't stop there. So yeah, I think that's my contribution. I hope it makes sense.
Use myself. So I think I'm going to go over to Aisha now. Yeah, since I think it's quite trying to spotlight her and it's not working. Yeah, I'm just going to go. Yeah, spotlight.
Don't worry, you can hear me, it's fine.
Yeah, I can hear you. I'll spotlight myself. Since you have been mentioned, I was going to come over to you anyway, talk about the great work you've been doing already. And your suggestion was that we focus on African history, including African history achievements, knowledge about the continent in education, and sort of piggybacking on what Furaha has just said. For the work you're doing and for any other person who wants to kind of do similar work, what is needed to get African history, African achievements into education?
To not start on a negative, but it's important to acknowledge racism within the current education system is rife. And we have to understand that and be willing and honest, and we'll have to be in a position where we admit that. People often say, why do we talk to kids about racism? Well, what we have to understand is as young as 0 to 5, which is the age frame in which we learn the most, we absorb our belief systems. And for many young children, if that belief system doesn't contain information about all communities, doesn't understand the value in different communities, doesn't allow us to explain the contribution that the African communities have made, those children grow up, whether they are Black or white, without a sense of self-knowledge or even information that empowers them enough to understand that we are all contributors. So one of the projects that I have been working on was called What's in a Name? And that project was actually born out of a conversation with a Zimbabwean friend of mine who told me that his name was Whisper, and he was named that because his granddad wanted a quiet child for his mother because he was number 10. That then created a project called What's in a Name, and that allowed us to start with the understanding of how within Africa different people have different names for different meanings and what those names meant. That allowed us to then translate it to other communities and say, well, what does your name mean? Where does that stem from? What you're able to then do is create a framework that allows for conversation and understanding that doesn't feel overbearing to those who don't feel like they have the knowledge or understanding, but allows the drip effect of this information. Often teachers will say they're barriers because they don't know. So what I've tried to do is create a program and a mechanism that removes those barriers so we can drip feed this information in. You're delivering a maths lesson, for example. You can talk about the Moors in terms of algebra. You can talk about Kathleen Johnson and what she did in terms of getting a rocket into the sky in terms of her mathematics prowess. If we're talking about, contributors of the traffic light system, or we're looking at the way in which we contribute to sanitary towels, whatever it may well be, we can drip feed this information in, because ultimately creating a separate Black history curriculum perpetuates the same ideology that we're a bolt on as extra information. We need to make sure that this is truly embedded. It becomes a golden thread in what we do. So this is just information that we all need to know, so we see the value in the continent. That is the kind of approach I've taken to this work, because once we do that, we dismantle this ideology that we are insubordinate and that we are not good enough. But what it also means is for that our white children, and particularly a white child who said to me, I didn't know before your presentation, miss, that Black people could do anything. Why? Because in the education system, we were never represented. So for her, in her own belief system and in her own background, that information was never shared. She now understands the contribution they had made. But even more beautiful, a Black child then said, miss, now I know that I can do something. I am more than the stereotype that they provide for me in my education. That's got to be a beautiful thing that we have to continue to build.
Aisha, thank you, Aisha. That was beautiful. I know you have to go off quite slightly early, so I'm just going to ask you the second question. Question. So, based on your reading of the executive or of the summary of the outcome document, is there anything that you think we should be doing or we should be thinking about that is missing from the outcome document?
It's not so much that I think something's missing. I think there needs to be much more, emphasis on the connectivity of education and ensuring that it's a thread. I think sometimes what happens is that there's so much focus at the academic level of university that sometimes secondary schools, primary schools, and often early years are lost in that communication, and yet the work that you want to do at an academic level in terms of university, imagine if that could be differentiated down so it connects with our babies, with those children that are growing up now. That connectivity provides that information from birth. If we want to change the generation that is growing now, if we want to empower them with the right knowledge, if we want to dismantle the current structures that exist, then we need to connect the different age groups. Imagine an 18-year-old working with a 2-year-old in terms of sharing that knowledge. That would be powerful. So it's not that something's missing. I think it's about emphasizing the connection of education across the generations.
I'm speaking with my microphone on mute. Thank you, Aisha. So I'm going to
can I just say thank you? Because I do need to leave, so I apologize for leaving early, but I just want to say thank you very much. And I really appreciate, Foluke, all the work that you've done. I think you are a pillar of strength. You have emphasized the importance of Africa in a way that I haven't seen in a very long time. And to stand in the University of Bristol and actually get this voice out, and for it to be not just in our city but nationally, it's a beautiful thing. And please keep doing what you do, because I look up to you and you're a beautiful, awesome Black woman that I look at and I'm like, wow, I'm proud to say that I know you. So thank you for all that you do.
Thank you so much, Aisha. You're making me blush now. Thank you so much. So I'm going to hand over the same question to Sheila. So is anything missing? I know you've got lots of notes.
Similarly to Aisha, actually, I think we need a stronger emphasis on intergenerational exchange, and also on figuring out how to equip people with revolutionary teachings, and to figuring out how to encourage them to continue the fight, even when they're in situations that seem less than radical. A lot of students, for instance, at the University of Bristol, learn about all these amazing things and then realize that they are too broke to actually be revolutionaries. They can't do it because they don't have generational wealth, and so they end up working for a law firm that is soul crushing, instead of doing the work that they actually want to be doing. So I think we need to figure out ways to help them continue with the struggle even while they have to survive under capitalism. I also think that we need to teach students more practical skills about how to utilize what they have in order to fight for rights. I think about Gen Z kids using TikTok in order to spam the Dallas police when they wanted to get information on protesters in Dallas, or when K-pop fans used their fan cams, which are basically videos of their favorite bands, to disrupt All Lives Matter hashtags, or when K-pop fans also bought out tickets for Trump's Tulsa rally so that people couldn't actually attend, so that Trump supporters couldn't attend. I also think about how disabled, queer, and trans communities have always had systems of mutual aid, emotional support, activism, recuperation. They've always had an abolitionist framework for how they operate. And I think that we need to center these modes of thinking, because currently there seems to be a real emphasis on the kind of big man in revolutionary thought. We focus so much on what these great men said, and we actually totally ignore the scholarship and the work of Black women, Black disabled people, Black queer people throughout time. And I think once we move away from the big man frame of thinking towards a more collectivist, shared exchange of ideas, then we'll really be able to not only teach people from the outset to respect and to implement the ideas of those who are marginalized, but we'll move away from the idea that we need one leader to save us and to liberate us, when in fact it's a collective effort towards liberation.
Thank you. That was beautiful. I need to sort of say this again, because I said it yesterday in the last webinar. You know, the article by Nanjala Nyambola, the Kenyan writer, on Pan-Africanism, I think is absolutely beautiful. You know, you talked about the centering of, you know, this man, and you know, some of these people have done really great things, but then by centering those sorts of people, you then erase the work of people who are constantly re-envisioning in very creative ways a whole different world. So they're not trying to, you know, as I said, try and find a space on the table. They're saying, do away with this hierarchy, do away with these tables. So yeah, if you haven't read that Pan-Africanism by Nanjala Nyambola, definitely, she's probably going to, because I every single time I mention Pan-Africanism, I seem to mention her name. So she's probably going to start feeling, you know, an itching in her ear. So same question, I will hand over to Furaha. Is there anything missing, or is there anything we need to emphasize a little bit more?
So I'm just going to piggyback off of what Sheila had said about encouraging us, again, on an individual level, to start working. So to take the points that have already been put forward and kind of funnel them down onto what we can do, maybe just including, you know, just that emphasis on don't wait to join an organization to do this, whilst also, you know, being respectful of self-care, that not everyone can necessarily, for whatever reason, put themselves out there. But just to say, you know, on an individual level, in your tiny circle of influence, what can you start doing? And perhaps focus on, you know, whatever points you are most passionate about, or where you feel you may have the most impact. So yeah, I think that's basically all I can add.
Thank you so much. So we're going to go over to the audience now. I can't see any questions.
I think I'm frozen.
Sorry? Yeah, okay. Let me spotlight myself. Yeah, there is a question. Okay, so someone has said, what is striking in all the discussion, and I find it striking as well, is empowerment for radical demands, for self-knowledge, for radical knowledge. And yeah, I completely agree with that. You know, it's kind of, I think Sheila mentioned that, and Furaha also mentions this sometimes, you know, the idea of being quite limited in our visions of when we're talking about change. And this is why I really struggle with EDI, equality, diversity, inclusion. I really struggle with that representation, because it's not re-envisioning. It is moving, we're kind of moving the site of oppression. how do you, within a structure which it in itself, when we're talking about systematic oppression or the systematic discrimination, how do you include people in that structure without reoppressing? And yeah, I struggle with understanding how you can do that without re-envisioning the structure or doing away with the structure. Any more questions? Was there anything that our speakers would like to add? Because I know you've got notes. Yeah?
So this is me being cheeky, and it's not actually adding to the conversation, but it's just to say thank you so much, Foluke, for everything. You know, Foluke is an amazing person. Everyone that I've encountered that has encountered her has been really blessed. At the beginning of this, you know, she had mentioned about me being a precarious migrant because I've had issues with the Home Office for close to a year. And Foluke really literally was one of the people who saved my life when I was at my lowest point last year. So I just want to say that this is a woman that, you know, when you see what she's doing in all of these different spaces, what you see is what you get. She's not just doing this for show. She is really impacting our lives. And again, I just want to say that she is one of the Black women who has literally saved my physical life. I don't want to go into too much about what she did, but she knows herself. She was with me on one of the most horrible days of my life last year, with me in spirit, with me through prayer, sending me messages, checking up on me. So Foluke, I just want to say, you know what? You are really a pillar within our community. You are my big sister. I love you so much. I'm so grateful for you. And I just hope that, you know, everything that we're trying to do here, that we're able to do it so that we can create a better starting point for those who are to come. So God bless you, and I love you so much. So that's all for me.
Okay, we do have one question now that you have completely embarrassed me. So I'm going to put you on the spot with this question, and Sheila, start thinking about, because I'm sure you will have something to say about that too as well, Sheila. I wish people would stop embarrassing me. So there's a question: how can young Africans balance the need to further Pan-Africanism and African enlightenment with the need to build wealth within Western capitalist structures? Sheila has slightly alluded to that, you know, question of people being broke, and then you have to be a revolutionary while you're broke. But Furaha, what do you think? How do we do this?
Okay, so I'm just going to say that I do not think that I am the most knowledgeable person to answer this question. I think you need somebody who has a very good grounding in theory of capitalism. I'm a bioscientist, but let me try and give my offering. What I would say first and foremost is that it's so difficult. It's so difficult because we have all of these messages being thrown at us. And I think particularly those of us in the diaspora, to an extent, it's very easy for us to say what people on the African continent should be doing. So I just want to say, so I was born and raised in Nigeria, and I know that in Nigeria, even itself as one country, you know, situations and circumstances are different depending on your state, even within one state, depending on your class, depending on, you know, based on colorism, based on so many different things. So this is all just to say that really and truly, I think that our modes of thinking in the West, even though we are Black, they're not necessarily things that we can use to theorize on what people on the African continent should be doing. So I'm just going to put that kind of as a caution. I know I've not answered the question, but basically I just want to say, I know it's a cliche, but we need to be kind with how much instruction we're trying to give, because it will come across as though, you know, well, it's so easy for you because you are in a place where at the very least, you have a whole lot of privilege. So yeah, sorry not to be able to answer the question. I know my range, I respect my range, but I just want to put that out there as a word of caution, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I graduated from law school last year, so my grounding in anti-capitalist revolutionary literature is perhaps a little shaky. I think in trying to figure it out for myself, I try to keep the goal of freedom in mind. How can I work to help myself and others get free, even if that's just in my immediate circle of friends and family. I think having small goals while struggling under capitalism is perhaps somewhere to start. You know, having difficult conversations with people who seem to be stuck in their modes of thought, which are oppressive, being able to go out to protest or to do a protest from home or to donate what you have, finding ways to use mutual aid and to support the people in your community who are in need. That can't end capitalism in and of itself. But I think when you're stuck in a middle ground between wanting to be a revolutionary and needing to go work at the bank, you have to find a way to embed practices of liberation within your everyday life. Again, as a person who lives in the West, I can't speak to how people on the continent should go about liberating themselves. I can only speak to maybe a little bit of what I've witnessed in Uganda, in terms of how I've seen communities who live under so much precarity, police brutality, who live under police surveillance because they belong to communities that are criminalized. And I think about the ways in which they support one another. They set up camps where they find therapists and they get donations from people in the West in order to, people in the West who aren't trying to shape the agenda of what they're doing. They use those resources in order to make sure that people back home have access to things like therapy, have access to things like daily necessities, food, clothing. They set up book groups. They set up forms of mutual aid that protect and support each other because they know that they're not going to get that protection from the state. So I think finding ways to support without trying to influence what's happening on the continent is maybe one way to go about it, but really just embedding practices of freedom into your everyday life, I think is an important way to start.
My mouse, okay. Thank you very much, Sheila. I actually think you both answered the question really well. There's an entire capitalist lecture in in that question. There's also an international development lecture in the question as well, which you actually both addressed that point. You know, how do we tell people living on the continent? And I'm quite cautious about what I say. You have to do this. And I generally like to address myself to people who are within this space, you know, things that I think we should be doing, which, you know, I can also sort of take responsibility for, you know, including myself in that, and questions of accountability. But I think what it comes down to, both on the continent and here, but mostly, you know, like I said, this is a space I can address directly, is a question of what we value. And I think that is the central question that renders capitalism itself, you know, as something that we constantly talk about when we say we are anti-capitalist. If you think about a university education, how do we say, or how do we judge or assess whether or not university education is value for money? Because that phrase has been thrown around a lot. So what we're suggesting, or what we suggest in our assessment, is if someone graduates from the university and within the first year they're able to have a salary of £40,000 per annum per year, then their degree is value for money. However, if they are somewhere in some remote, and when I say remote, it's only remote to us, it's not remote to the people who live in whatever this remote place is. If someone goes off to a remote place and is saving lives, but they are basically, you know, they're feeding from hand to mouth because, you know, where they're working, they're unable to sort of, they're not paid very much. We would then suggest that their degree is not value for money. And that's essentially the capitalist problem. But how do we then break free from that? If we are broke, if we have to, you know, and when we talk about, you know, and that's why, you know, you've both highlighted really significant problems about people who are living in sort of in a quite different circumstances from those that we are, you know, we're living in. How do we break free when what it seems the structure is suggesting is that we should try and achieve within the structure? And the only way you can achieve within the structure is to be complicit within the structure. And the only way in which you can change the structure, to have the voice to change within the structure, is to be complicit in the structure. So it then becomes a conundrum. And again, like I said, it's an entire lecture, but I do think we can educate ourselves on why we have a massive decolonization movement, why we have a massive anti-capitalist movement, why Black Lives Matter is, you know, now, you know, this is, like I said yesterday, Black Lives Matter is not new. The Pan-African movement in the 19th century was essentially Black Lives Matter. So they called it, they were saying anti-racist struggles, anti-colonialist struggle, anti-apartheid struggles are all the same. That's Black Lives Matter. So why, you know, the literature behind all this and how they are connected, we can educate ourselves. And, you know, as Aisha was talking about, you know, the drip effect. If we keep quiet, then nothing can change. Do what we can, and then hopefully things can change and be better. And Furaha says we should think of how we can give a better world. How can those come in after us? How would, you know, what are they going to inherit? Because if we do not think about things like, you know, how environmental racism and environmental justice is implicated in all of this, generations coming are going to inherit dust, nothing. So we need to think about how the generations coming ahead of us are going to inherit something better than we actually received from the generation before. I think, because I'd like to stop not at the dot of 1 o'clock, so that people can have, especially if you've got lots of Zoom meetings, you can have an 8-minute breather between this meeting and the next one. Thank you all for joining us. You can still sign up to tomorrow's webinar. So tomorrow we're going to be talking about next steps. We're really going to be centering things like environmental justice, talking about the continent. You can sign up till 1 a.m. So GMT +1. So GMT, I can never tell which one. So 12 midnight GMT. You can still sign up for the next webinar till then. And we will be joined by, I will be in conversation with Dr. Edson Burton of this parish of Bristol, and Professor Babatunde Fagbayibo, who is a university lecturer in South Africa. So it's very good. It's going to be a very cross-diaspora conversation. So do please join us. Thank you so much. Have a lovely afternoon. And I hope to see you tomorrow. So see you. Thank you very much. Bye.